This is part 2 of the 4-part video series making the Lego Robot Educator driving base. In this part we will make the left motor assembly and join it to the right motor assembly and then place a bottom reinforcement on that unit. We will cover steps 14 through 23. Step 14 calls for one of the large motors and a 3M peg with friction. This time I have the large motor oriented so that the plug end is on the right and the drive head is on the left. Again, we'll be adding this peg to the top 3 connector that's sitting above the drive head and a little bit to the right. Take the short end and put it into the hole that is nearest to the front of the motor, the front being the end with the drive head. In step 15 we will be adding 5 parts. First we have an angular beam that is 3 by 7. We have 2 of the longer 3M pegs with friction. We have one of the short pegs with friction. And then we have one of the friction cross-axle connectors. That's the kind that has a round end on one end and the axle connector on the other end. We'll start by orienting the angular beam so that the 7 side is horizontal and the 3 side is coming down at an angle to the left. So the 3 side is coming down at an angle on the left side. We'll take our friction cross-axle connector and we will insert the end with the cross into the last hole on the 3 side of our angular beam. Next we'll take one of the 3M pegs with friction and we're going to insert the longer side into the corner hole of our angular beam. So we should have pegs sticking out on both the back side and the top side. And then we'll take the other 3M peg with friction and again we'll insert the long side and it will go directly next to the peg we just inserted into the corner on the right side. So now you should have a peg sticking up on the bottom left and then pegs sticking out to the top and back on both the corner and to the right of the corner. And then we'll take our last little peg with friction and we're just putting pegs in a row kind of on the top. So next to the peg we just inserted, we'll put that short peg. So you won't feel anything coming out on the back of that one, but on the top from the corner there will be 3 pegs in a row. Now this assembly gets added to our left motor. Again, we have our motor oriented so the plug is to the right and the drive head is to the left. And the peg that is sticking up out of the left motor is going to go into the 3rd hole from the right on the long side of our angular beam. So that the right end of the angular beam will be flush with the end of the connector that's on the top of the motor. In step 16 we have 2 pieces, a 4M axle and a 2M axle extension, which we will put together by inserting the axle into the end of the extender until it won't go any further. Then take the left motor assembly and orient it so that the plug is facing towards you. The side of the angular beam that has pegs, the most pegs sticking out, there are 5 pegs sticking out, is on the outside left. There are just 2 pegs sticking out on the inside right. And then the axle with the axle extender that we just made is going to go through the back end of that connector that's on the top of the motor and the last hole of the angular beam. So it's coming from the inside to the outside. And when it's all the way inserted, you should have an axle that is sticking out 1 length at the back of that beam. Then you'll feel a space, then a peg, then a space, then 3 pegs in a row up to the corner, then a space, and then finally 1 peg in the bottom corner of the 3 side of the angular beam. In step 17, we have 3 parts. We have an angle beam that is 3 by 5, 90 degrees, and 2 of our little pegs with friction. Take the angular beam and orient it so that the longer side, the 5 side, is vertical, and the 3 side is horizontal at the top, pointing off to the left. Take one of the connector pegs and put it into the bottom hole on the 5 side, then skip a hole and put the other connector peg in. We're going to add this to our motor assembly. And on the motor assembly, you remember there are 3 pegs kind of in a row on the top, with the peg to the last peg on the left is in the corner of the angular beam. Those 3 pegs will go into the top 3 holes of our L-shaped beam that we are working on. And remember that the short end is pointing off to the left. So once you get this added, the long side should be centered on the drive head. In step 18, we have 1 piece to add, and that is an 8M axle with an end stop. That axle is going to go through the center of our drive head. We'll orient the motor assembly so that the plug is facing towards us, and then we'll take the axle with the end stop and we're going to insert it from right to left so that the axle end will be sticking out on the left side, which is the outside for the left motor. Just push it through until it won't go any further. In step 19, we have 1 piece, which is a 3M beam. Take our motor assembly and now we'll lie it on its side so that the plug is to the right and the drive head is on the left, and that tall axle is sticking up. And where that tall axle is sticking up, that is going to go into the center hole of our 3M beam, and the pegs on the either side of that axle will go into the other holes on the top and bottom of that 3M beam, and it will just snap in place there. In step 20, we have 3 parts: a 4x4 angular beam, a 4M axle with end stop, and 1 of the friction cross axle connectors. We'll start with that friction cross axle connector, and we'll add it to our left motor assembly. Now I have the left motor assembly oriented so that the plug is to the right and the drive head is on the left, and then sticking out on the far left coming down is the end of our 3x7 angular beam. Now there's a peg sticking out of the bottom hole, and then there's an empty hole. And that empty hole is where we will add our friction cross axle connector, putting the round end in there. Now when you add that connector, try to keep the cross oriented so that it is square with the angle of that beam, and that will make it easier to add the 4x4 angular beam in the next step. So when we add the 4x4 angular beam, we'll orient it so the point is facing towards us. And the peg that we just added will fit into the right cross end on that beam, and then the peg that is on the very end of the motor assembly will go into the round hole. So you'll have two connections that you're making with that 4x4 angular beam. And you might have to wiggle it around a little bit to get that cross oriented just right into the hole there. And then just make sure everything is firmly attached. Our last piece to add in this step is the 4M axle with end stop, and to add that I'm going to take the left motor and I'm going to change its orientation so that the plug end is facing me. And then the 4M axle is going to go into the very end that's sticking out at the top of that angular beam, the 4x4 angular beam that we just added. And you'll insert it from right to left so that that axle is sticking out on the left. And so you'll end up with an axle sticking out on the left at the very front, and an axle sticking out to the left in the middle of the drive head. And there's also a little axle sticking out closest to the body of the motor, also on the left. Now we're ready to connect our two motor assemblies. So have the left motor assembly on my left, and I'm bringing in the right motor assembly. And on the right motor assembly, on the left side of it, which is the center, we have that vertical beam frame. And we're going to make connections at 3 points. There are two pegs sticking out towards the center on the left motor, and those two pegs will go into the bottom two holes on the beam frame. And then on the right motor assembly, there is an axle sticking out to the left, and that axle is going to go into the axle extender that is on the left motor. I think it's easiest to start with the two pegs in the front and get them started, or at least aligned a little bit. And then you should be able to feel that the axle from the right motor is lining up with the axle extender on the left motor. On the front connection, you'll put your fingers on the inside, or your thumb on the inside, and just kind of squish that connection together. And for the axle connection in the back, just kind of press all that, and then give everything a good press from both the left side and the right side so that you know everything is seated properly. So now you're left with an assembly with the cable ends of the motors facing towards you. The beam frame is sticking up with two connectors, and then you should be able to feel the two longer axles sticking out to the left and right. There's also a shorter little axle sticking out to the left and the right nearer to the main body of the motors. In steps 22 and 23, we will add some reinforcement to the bottom of our construction. And step 22 calls for one piece, which is a 5x11 beam frame. And I'm going to take that beam frame and orient it so that the longer sides are horizontal. And then on our robot construction, I have it oriented where the plugs on the motors are closest to me, and the beam frame that is vertically, that has the two pegs sticking up, that's the top. So I'm going to take that whole assembly and flip it over. And so now I'm looking at the bottom. And on the end that's closest to me On each motor, you can see that there is a 3M connector, and then there's like a 1M space in between to another 3M connector. And we have the same thing on both of those motors. And then notice on our beam frame that there are two the short sides have two little legs, and those are 3M long. And so they will each fit into the space on those motors, so it just locks in there. So if you just kind of move it around, it should set right in there and not wiggle around too much. In our next step, we'll add some connectors so that it won't move around. In step 23, we will add 4 friction pins to hold that beam frame in place. These are the 2M friction pins with cross holes. They have a 2M end, and then they have a larger end that's actually more like a bushing. A cross axle could fit in there. So we're going to add 2 of those on each side, and we'll take our motor construction assembly, and I'm just turning it 90 degrees so that now I still have the bottom facing up. I have the plugs for the motors on the left, and then on the motor itself there are 2 round connections. There's actually a round connection, a cross axle connection, and another round connection. And in the 2 round connection points, we'll take one of our friction pins and we'll push it in, and that will lock, because it's 2M long, it will lock into that leg of the beam frame that is sitting next to that place. We'll do that on one side, and then keep the bottom facing up, and then just turn it 180 degrees so that now our plug ends of the motor are on the right side. And again, just kind of tip it up a little bit, and you will see the connectors on the bottom of the motor. And again, we'll take our friction pegs and put them in the round holes, push them through to lock the beam frame in place. So now that beam frame is securely in place. This is the end of part 2. And we can just put that unit aside for a few minutes while we build the caster wheel.